Today's young people have grown up in a nation where gun violence has somehow been normalized, where active shooter drills is as common as air raid drills was when I was growing up. When the truth is there's nothing normal about it. Ultimately, the Keep America Safe Act is just one step out of many we must take to fix the nation's broken gun laws. From my view, we must also reinstate the full assault weapons ban. We must require thorough background checks on every gun sale, whether it's at a store or a gun show or online with a click of a button. And we must make sure that we look beyond the reforms that we should have passed yesterday and begin addressing the threats of tomorrow, like the rise of 3D printed firearms. That's why I'm also introducing new legislation to combat the spread of blueprints for ghost guns around the world. Shortly after Parkland, many of us had hoped the president meant what he said when he suggested that he was able to stand up to the NRA. But he has caved into the gun lobby just as countless politicians before him. It's just one more reminder that loosening the NRA's paralyzing grip over Washington is not something that we will achieve overnight. But we know this challenge can be and will be solved because we know the American people are with us. So we must not give up. We must keep up the fight. And I'm really enthused by the new Democratic majority in the House of Representatives that is willing to take this challenge on and that can make the statement never again truly a reality. And with that, let me introduce my colleague from the House of Representatives, been a tremendous champion in this turning tragedy into something positive, Congressman Deutch.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Senator Menendez. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Senator Menendez, and all of the great champions from the House and Senate who are standing here with me, Senators Blumenthal and Murphy, who represent the Sandy Hook community, Congresswoman Titus, who represents Las Vegas community, Congresswoman DeGette can be with us this morning. She represents the Columbine community. What is the Keep American Safe Act all about? It's about seconds, just seconds. Seconds matter. The few seconds that it takes to reload a weapon matter. Those seconds can make all of the difference. Those seconds can save a life. Seconds matter. Before February 14th, I said to my colleagues time and time again, you should not have to have a mass shooting take place in your congressional district to care about gun violence in America. Because gun violence happens in America every day, in every district, in every part of this country. And then that tragic day a year ago Thursday, happened in Parkland, Florida, in Stoneman Douglas High School, where a gunman killed 17 and injured 17 others. He fired more than 150 rounds in 6 minutes. He reloaded 5 times, 150 rounds in 6 minutes in 6 magazines. We know that seconds mattered in those hallways. Students ran down those hallways desperately seeking safety. And we know that seconds can make the difference. It is simple math. Seconds matter. These magazines were made for the battlefield. They weren't made for our communities. We don't want any other members of Congress standing up here with us because they represent the next worst mass shooting in American history. What we want is for members of Congress to realize that we need to do something today about gun violence. A year ago, the March for Our Lives movement did not exist. A year later, we stand here surrounded by young people who, motivated by their young peers, have stepped up because they're tired of seeing their friends die around them. It is not too soon to talk about gun violence. It is not too soon to talk about strengthening our gun laws. It's not too soon to pass this bill. It is not too soon to give the American people a few extra seconds that can save lives. The time to act is right now, and that's why we're here. That's what this legislation will do. And I'm proud to stand here with so many leaders from the House and Senate, the March for Our Lives community, and my dear friends, Patricia and Manuel Oliver, whom you'll hear from. It's now my privilege and honor to introduce one of the many champions, real leading voices in the efforts to bring common sense gun safety measures to the Congress, Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Senator Menendez, as well, for your unflinching leadership. And my thanks to my colleague from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, who has been part of a team, really a team, since our common experience at Sandy Hook. Of course, like Senator Menendez and others who are here, I had actually worked on this issue for some 2 decades as Attorney General of our state. But the urgency and immediacy of this effort really came from our being at Sandy Hook during that difficult time. And we saw and we heard the difference that these high-capacity magazines made there. Children literally escaped. They fled as a result of those precious seconds when the shooter had to reload. Again and again and again, what we see in these mass shootings is that the key enabler is a high-capacity magazines or a collection of high-capacity magazines that literally enable the increased lethality of assault weapons and other guns. They come in all sizes and shapes. They come in different forms. They come with different expenses. What they have in common is they are literally force multipliers. They are force multipliers for evil. Guns become doubly and triply deadly in these massacres because of these high-capacity magazines. And so if we take one simple step in approving this prohibition, we can literally save lives. There is no more simple, straightforward way to save lives from gun violence than to ban these high-capacity magazines and to take them off the streets through buybacks. And I've been amazed at the increasing popularity of buybacks generally. We have them more commonly than ever before in Connecticut, and I'm sure throughout the country. But buybacks of these magazines can also help save lives. Let me just say, finally, I want to thank the organizations and the advocates who are represented here today. Your presence is so powerful, as it has been throughout this effort. We're going to need you there in this continuing effort. And the colleagues that we have from the House are so very important. How exciting to see gun violence prevention win this November. Make no mistake, gun violence prevention was on the ballot last November. It was on the ballot and it won. We may lack a majority in the Senate, but we have come a long way. And clearly the American people want this kind of simple, common step that will stop guns from having force multipliers for evil, designed for war, solely engineered to kill people. They're not designed for hunting. They're not designed for recreation. They have a purpose, and they do it very efficiently, killing people. The NRA is on its heels. The NRA, as one of my colleagues likes to say, should be known as not relevant anymore. Not relevant anymore. We still have a battle ahead, but this measure ought to be a no-brainer. And I'm very proud to be here today with my great colleague, Chris Murphy. Chris?
Thank you very much, Dick, and thank you to Bob for being such a champion on this issue, to Ted as well for his leadership in the House. Listen, the reality is that Americans want us to respond to this epidemic of mass shootings. Increasingly, restrictions on these killing machines are more and more popular all across the country. In Sandy Hook, children fled that school, most likely, while the shooter fumbled with an exchange. But like in Parkland, because that shooter had 30-round magazines, he only had to make 5 or 6 exchanges. How many more children would have fled those classrooms in Sandy Hook had that shooter had to make 15 or 20 different cartridge exchanges? In Tucson, people are alive because when Jared Lee Loughner fumbled an exchange, civilians were able to stop that shooting in its tracks. This isn't theory. This is what happens in practice. And it's not just the 30-round magazines that are legal today. Shooters can get their hands on 100-round drums of ammunition. And no one knows that better than Lon and Stephanie Phillips, who are in the audience today, whose daughter was killed in the Aurora shooting when James Holmes walked in with that kind of firepower. So we need to get this passed, and we need to get it passed quickly. Half of all mass shooters in the country walk into their place of massacre with a high-capacity magazine. And I will tell you, increasingly, we are finding these high-capacity magazines in other settings as well. More and more guns that are being picked up from crime scenes in places like Hartford or Baltimore or Chicago have the capacity to take these high-capacity magazines as well. They are becoming more and more plentiful, not just in the hands of mass shooters, but also in other settings as well. It is absolutely unacceptable that 6 years since Sandy Hook, this Congress has done absolutely nothing of substance to address this routine of massacre that happens all across this country. Dick is right. Congress is changing. Year by year, we get more and more champions who are coming here to stand up with us to make these common sense changes. The House of Representatives is transformed from a time when only 1 or 2 members of the House would stand up and introduce and propose legislation to stop this epidemic of shooting. We now have an army of advocates there, and one of them is my great friend, the Congresswoman from Nevada, Dina Titus.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm Dina Titus, and as a member of the House Gun Violence Prevention Caucus and a co-sponsor of this legislation, I'm honored to stand here arm in arm with my colleagues from the Senate, and especially Peter Deutch for his leadership in the House on this important issue, and with the young advocates behind us who have done so much to bring this issue to the public's attention. And they have been successful because most of the public agrees with us. The majority are on our side that something needs to be done. We are too plagued by gun violence all across the country, and my district, Las Vegas, is no exception. Right here on October 1st, gunman opened fire on a rock concert and killed 58 people in one fell swoop. How many more cities do we have to add to this map before something is done? This year at the State of the Union address, I kept my guest seat empty in memory of those 58 people. I hoped that the president would see that empty seat and it would dawn on him that something needs to be done. But you know, that is just a gesture, it's just a symbol. People are tired of that. They are tired of hearts and prayers and thoughts and wishes and moments of silence. They want action. They want action on the high-capacity magazines, on background checks, on bump stocks. We have got to move this legislation forward. You have my commitment. I know you are all there on the front lines for us. I thank you for that, and I look forward to seeing something happen so we don't keep adding stars to that map. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. Let me call Charlie Mirsky, representative of March for Our Lives.
Thank you, Senator Menendez, and thank you for this opportunity for us to show our support for this legislation. In the time it takes to reload a gun, a life can be saved. Last year, nearly 40,000 Americans died due to guns. 17 of those lives were taken from us this week a year ago at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Gun violence in America must stop, and it requires legislation like CASA to ensure our government does everything it can so kids can go to school without fear. People shouldn't have to worry about going to a concert or to the mall or to a place of worship, worried that they may never come home again. March for Our Lives is thankful to Representative Deutch, Senator Menendez, Representative Titus, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, and every member of Congress who supports legislation to end gun violence in America. Today's bill and others that have been introduced or will be introduced show unprecedented momentum for gun violence prevention legislation. But many of you know, introduction of legislation is just the first step in a long process. We can't stop with press conferences like these. We need the full support of every member of Congress if we are to keep our communities safe and end the nation's epidemic of gun violence. Ending gun violence shouldn't be a partisan issue, and we applaud Republicans and Democrats for working together to stop gun deaths in America. March for Our Lives will, once again, take this message to the masses to remind them that their historic turnout didn't end on Election Day. We will organize like we have in the past to demand our elected officials change the laws, or we will vote into office those that will. Thank you.
And then, lastly, but very importantly, Manuel Oliver, who is with Change the Ref and who lost a son in Parkland.
Thank you. We are tired. We are very tired, and you're right. But we are tired, and we lost our son. You should be tired before losing your son or your daughter. You don't want to be where we are. You should be part of this change that we are demanding. We're not asking, we're not begging. We demand. I have two words for everybody behind those cameras. Why not? Why are we even having this discussion? Have you realized how simple this is to approve? We're just reducing the amount of ammunition on a gun that you can still carry with less ammunition inside. Is that so hard to understand? Do we need these smart people discussing this so you can understand it? No, we are tired. This is not blue. This is not red. A shooter won't ask you, who do you represent before killing you? My son is not here, but we are here. Your sons and daughters are still here. Do your role. Do your parenting role the right way. Congress and Senate, now you are bigger and bigger because you have people outside of this building. And there's a lot of us, and we are all tired. So please, without wasting any more time, while I'm telling you this, someone is being shot. So please, without wasting any more time, remember that we're tired, and just approve this ASAP. Thank you.
Thank you, Manoj. Questions? And I have my colleagues join me in answering. Yeah.
What makes you optimistic that this will pass now in the Senate? There is still a Republican majority in that chamber as opposed to in the House where the Democrats are.
Well, I think several things. Number one is the reality of a Democratic majority sending legislation. I believe this week they're starting on background checks, if I'm not mistaken. That created an impetus and a challenge for the Republican leader in the Senate. Are you going to silence the voices that want to see reasonable gun safety measures, or are you going to give it a up or down vote on the Senate floor? We're going to test in every way we can that proposition. Secondly, I think that the elections, I do believe that what Senator Blumenthal said is very powerful, that this issue was a significant issue in the elections and sent a very clear message. And so I think the combination of having action by the House and then creating a focus here in the Senate is going to create the type of pressure, and we will look for the right moment to see if we can actually draw a vote through some procedural process, if we cannot get a simple up or down vote by the majority leader. But I think the American people will know who stands on the side of reasonable gun safety measures and who does not. And that will be a vivid reminder as we approach 2020. But I would hope we don't have to wait to then. I hope that the Senate Majority Leader gives us an opportunity on this legislation and on the background checks on the Senate floor, and let the Senate be the Senate. Let it act. And then ultimately we will know where it stands. I'm inviting my colleagues to join me in that regard.
I would just make one observation. Thanks, Senator. There are two houses of Congress, but there is only one electorate. And the dozens of new members of the House who now form a gun safety majority in the House of Representatives were elected in large part because they were willing to stand on the side of their families and safety in their communities over the side of the gun makers. And the senators from their states represent the same people. And the hope, our hope on our side, is that those senators will come to that realization themselves and understand that just as all of those House members who for years thought they could sit back and pretend that the voices coming from their communities advocating for change weren't going to affect them, those voices have been silenced and they've been replaced by a gun safety majority. The senators who represent them should recognize that the same possibility exists for them. They should stand with families and their communities for common sense measures that can help keep people safe.
I would just add, too, that you have never had this kind of groundswell of popular support on this side. People have not been as vocal. People have not been as out there advocating for this kind of legislation. And they're not just doing it in Washington. They're doing it in state capitals around the country. I know that in Nevada, the legislature is set to pass an anti-bump stock bill because Congress didn't do it after October 1st. So as that picks up from state to state, I think the momentum then begins to wash ashore here in Washington as well.
I think that's a really important point. What you're seeing on this issue, and I say this as a former state attorney general, is that states are leading the nation. And states are moving ahead with legislation on high-capacity magazines. They are moving ahead on bump stocks. They are moving ahead on red flag statutes or extreme risk protective order statutes. I'm looking forward to introducing a measure with bipartisan support very shortly on that issue. And they're moving ahead on background checks. We're going to see a background check bill come from the House. Who would have thought 6 months ago? Well, anybody following what's happening in the state legislatures can see it coming. And the second point is, very importantly, as Representative Deutch said, you know, for many, many years, what we saw nationally was elected officials up for re-election, sort of dodging, ducking, trying to finesse the issue of gun violence. This time, the winners in the House of Representatives, the new elected representatives, actually proactively campaigned on it. They made it an issue. That's why I say gun violence was on the ballot and it won. I think in the United States Senate, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are going to, at some point, go to their leadership and say, we need to do something. We need to do something because the overwhelming cry of the American people is, can't you do something? It's that simple. They don't say specifically, do this necessarily or do that. Can't you do something? And this bill is a very natural answer to that cry.
ATF just passed a ban on bump stocks. It's not yet fully implemented. Do you have faith in that way of getting at the problem? And why can't it apply to something like
I would like to be optimistic about that, but ATF already said they don't have the legislative authority to ban bump stocks. The president put it out there. I think it's a symbolic gesture. It will still take legislation. And just as we predicted, the ink wasn't dry on that before they had filed a lawsuit. So now it's held up in the courts while nothing is happening. So that's why we need to push forward with legislation and not leave it to something like that that really isn't going to work.
Sure. I mean, my thoughts are simple. That there are good people who work for ATF, but those of us who work in the Capitol, we work for the American people, and they shouldn't have to wait for an agency to take any action. They expect us to act on their behalf, and that's why it's urgent for Congress to take action. That's why tomorrow in the House of Representatives, the Judiciary Committee is going to be marking up a background check bill. Because we shouldn't have to wait for anyone else. It's based on history. Waiting gets people nowhere. I mean, to put more graphically, waiting gets people killed. We can't wait any longer.
You know, the giveaway ought to be the gun lobby said, oh, well, there's no need for legislation because it can be done administratively. That ought to be a pretty good sign of why we need legislation, especially when the gun lobby is then challenging the bump stock regulations and possibly tying them up in the courts for years and years. Well, that's a good question. You know, maybe one of us should have mentioned it. It's my view, at least, there needs to be comprehensive legislation. There's no one panacea. This measure is a discrete, unchallengeable, unquestionable way to save lives. That's the distinct advantage of moving forward separately. There may be different arguments against different measures. This one seems indubitably a way to save lives.
Can I say something about that question? Sure. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna pretend that I'm a part of these people that is actually writing laws. But I think that because of the big picture is so complicated for some groups to understand, we need to separate these in small victories. This is a small victory, easy to approve. It's like when you're feeding a baby, you're giving the soup, and you need to go slowly. Hey, here, you're gonna like it. It's gonna be good. It's gonna make you grow and be healthy. But you gotta go baby steps. So that's how I get it, and I actually feel okay with it, because I should be here demanding for way more than that. But I think this is easy to understand and let it pass for the benefit of all of us. I'm sorry about that. But,
Except for calling us babies.
oh, no, yeah. Very sorry about that.
I think your statements are more powerful than any one of us. But in any event, I'll just final point on that. Look, you know, many of us, as someone who voted for the assault weapons ban and is ready to do it again, as someone who believes in universal background checks, and someone who believes in high-capacity magazines, and someone who wants to end 3D printing of guns, I'd like to see a universal package. But I know what happens here. I've been around a while. And when you do it that way, very often somebody will find a reason in some element of that package to say, no, I can't support that. I would support this, but I can't support that. We're going to test the proposition. This is the simplest, fairest, easiest one to accept, because it doesn't deny somebody ammunition. It just says you can't have more than 10 rounds at one time. I think that's a hard argument to make. So we're going to test the proposition here in the Congress as to whether you really are for any reasonable gun safety measure or you're just totally beholden to the NRA, which is not beholden to the American people. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much.
It means a lot you're here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Thank you.